guarantees that this is going to put him all the way to
92.
92? Okay.
That was the investment payoff I calculated.
So Fred is going to be writing with his left hand, and I think he has a marker over here. He's going to do some writing. But Fred, one of the first times I met Fred, the topic of Common Core came up because one of Fred's great accomplishments was to help to initiate an organization that was concerned with standards and help to push forward the track that led towards Common Core. So I won't say that Fred is biased, but I will say he's got a great long-standing interest in the question of standards. But he's tolerant of opposing opinions, and so we hope there will be a lively discussion. Fred also is wearing his bulletproof vest underneath there. Don't have to worry. I have the attendance sheet here. I'll pass it around. But otherwise, Fred, welcome. Fred, welcome.
Thank you. And I had mentioned in an email earlier this year that I got my back fusion done and was willing to talk with anybody who had spinal stenosis about modern ways of back fusion, because it's a little, we say the medical profession is not forthcoming with some useful information about back operations, both for people my age and people in their 20s. So some people stood up and said, let's talk about it. And this is simply a rotator cuff. This is a long overuse of shoulders and rotator cuff muscles getting sore, and then last August a bad decision on a mountain bike. And I've committed to my caregiver here that I will stop. I'll ride only on 2 tracks and roads with the mountain bike, and no more So, Common Core State Standards. I put this together. I've had these ideas in my head a long time, so I've put this together for this presentation, and I'm looking forward to lots of input about this doesn't work right or doesn't get the information across correctly or whatever, because I think it's a long-term useful kind of thing to think about. Basically, my one-liner, 2 things I want to say before we start. My one-liner is rejecting the Common Core State Standards makes about as much sense as rejecting the metric system, because your Nissan didn't get engineered correctly. Rejecting the standards is like rejecting the basic metric system. And the second comment I would make is, I usually wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, and iPads and iPhones are handy things to not turn on the light to disturb the other person. And so I was reading David Brooks' article on state standards, that is Common Core State Standards, that he wrote about 3 weeks ago, and he said the circus has come to town, and this is an example of a really good idea where both the left and the right line up to cannons for stupid reasons. He didn't use the word stupid, but he was saying it, to really shoot it down. And if we lose time or lose the standards, we're really going to be, as a country, in bad shape. So I went back and reread that, and then I noticed there were 287 comments before the Times cut off the comments. And you can read all, or you can read user-selected, or you can read New York Times-selected comments. So I read the New York Times-selected comments, which I thought would be a rational set of people dealing with irrational comments. And I tell you, there was a lot of cannons aimed at this thing, and I said, man, am I opening myself up to all this stuff? Because there were very reasonable people saying this thing just isn't working for these reasons. But when you tease it apart, it's conflating testing with the standards, it's conflating curriculum development, it's conflating what looks like a national federal government program with standards. And the thing I set out to do today, and I realized it was the right thing, was to really get down to what the standards are and then start back to see all the stuff that gets layered on top of it. Like any good education thing, there's a little quizzes as we go along. And I'd like to take a show how many people think that the Common Core standards written by the National Government Association and this is Chief State School Officers, that's the head of the Department of Education in each state. How many think that statement is true? How many think that statement is false? And the rest of you aren't sure. That's right. That is a true statement. The Common Core state standards are written by the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is the people that run the schools. And essentially, this is a state-level effort. Arnie Duncan supports it, the Department of Education supports it. At one time, the Department of Education, by law, could not advocate for any standards. Congress stopped them from doing this. People would go to jail if the Department of Education did that. So basically, that's a true statement. Could we have the next slide, Mr. Parks? So basically, my basic position is that the Common Core state standards are the jewel of the standards-based reform movement, which is about 25 years old. And it's been a sequence of developments which we'll talk about. As David Brooks pointed out, it's being misrepresented by both sides of the argument. And we'll look at a couple of those misrepresentations, including misrepresenting the New York State Union of Teachers. The potential outcome is we lose all the work we've done, or we lose implementation time. And we fall further behind all the countries we worry about. Germany is my favorite choice, but you can look at Singapore, you can look at Czechoslovakia has great school performance. Eastern Europe has great school performance. So the goal today is, what exactly are the Common Core state standards? What are the objections? And if we have enough time, I'll get into the history, kind of the sequence of events that got us here, which is useful information, because all of us here today lived through that time. So, this was a comment picked up at the 96 Education Summit. There was a bunch of CEOs. Each governor brought a CEO from their state because there was concern in 96 that the standards movement wasn't going forward. We were still in a big mess. The CEO, who'd never been involved with standards, said, "Do we have to have standards in every state? Doesn't it? Aren't these facts true everywhere?" True or false? Federal government funds less than 10% of the total U.S. education. Who thinks that's true? Who thinks that's false? Okay, that's true. It's actually about 8.5%. The federal government is a very small part of the education funding model in this country, and yet they're attributed to driving so many things. And they do have some power to drive stuff, but it's all, the numbers I use are 45% local, meaning district taxes, 45% from the state, and then 10% from the federal government. That's roughly the numbers that have been true for decades. Next slide. Oh, I was gonna...
Full disclosure?
I was gonna do, I worked for over 25 years in the computer industry. When I got out, I wanted to work in education and computers. So I got a master's in education at Harvard, which is easier than it sounds. There's 600 slots and 1,200 applicants. I figured 2 to 1. Anybody with $18,000 in a year can get into that program. I took 2 years, and I anticipated going into district level technology because I was really interested in how computers could affect the teacher-student interface. And in the mid-90s, that was not a particularly rich area. And I got kind of into one class on policy and on standards, and I got offered a job in this national organization. I said, that's why you go to Harvard, is to meet people and get good jobs. So I have never worked in a district. My wife has 39 years experience in a district, and dinner conversations were really hot and heavy. Like, you come into the second grade classroom and you try to implement those standards. so long suffering. Okay, so here's some examples of the way the issues are being presented. And I want to give you a minute to read it, but note the headline, note the first bullet in each case, which is usually the lead paragraph, and then note the second bullet, which is the paragraph buried way down in the story.
Who is Louis C.K.?
I didn't know that either, but he's a famous stand-up comedian that is prominent enough on the East Coast so that he got an article or got quoted in the New Yorker magazine.
But I mean, actually,
He's a parent.
the purpose of that might be to show the foolishness of Louis C.K.
No, he was there blasting the tests and the homework his kids were coming home with living in Manhattan. And the whole article was on how awful parents are realizing students' environment is, stuff that the parents can understand, stuff that homework that the students can understand, and things. And the article was big on saying, and this percentage of parents are holding their kids out of school on the days of the tests because they're objecting to the tests. So it was a real anti-testing article. But the headline was Common Core. So I was intrigued when I saw the New York State Teachers Union, New York State Union of Teachers, which is 1,200 unions, which is a federation of unions across the state. And that political article struck me as strange because I thought teachers would be supporting it. So I went on their website, and you couldn't have a more positive advocacy for the state, the Common Core state standards, than the teachers have on their website. The Politico reported it as, of course, they also asked for the resignation of the New York State chief school officer, who they hold responsible for the poor implementation. The New Yorker has always been on their research, so I was surprised they were so sloppy on the headline. But they did have that down in the article, which is an accurate statement, which is what the teachers would say. And Fox News, of course, way down in the article is a very accurate statement, and we'll get into that patchwork of state standards, Common Core state standards in place. True or false? 1980 Republican platform and candidate Reagan advocated abolishing the Department of Education. How many think that's true? How many think that's false? A lot of abstainers here. That is absolutely true. The NEA and Carter got the Department of Education established in Carter's administration in 1979, and the Republicans were out to shoot that, and almost did. Came close. Next slide. So let's get some positive statements to offset the last one about what the Common Core state standards are. Read down through that and then see where I got this list from. So after the New York State United Teachers said we're for the standards, they also have this list of why the standards, what they are and why they're good. This is a quote from my informational interviews when I was thinking about retiring from the position in the computer industry and going and getting a degree. And Sharon worked in Newton, and Newton's about 80,000 people, so it's about 10,000 students. It's a good-sized school system, suburb. And the superintendent said, we are just getting second grades lined up so that the third grade teachers will know what the second grade students know consistently across the system, 30 second grade classrooms. Before that, every teacher was on their own. Not a way to smoothly run. Is there a breath there? I don't know. You gonna object?
We had curriculum guides that looked like that, and every new teacher used it. So it wasn't like you were just...
His comment was that there really isn't we can't count on the consistency, that every first grader is going to come out with full phonetics, or at least well-established belief. A couple of comments. Strangely enough, it wasn't until the late 90s that people said, you know, do high schools produce students who can fulfill the entry requirements in the normal state college and state university? Nobody had asked that question, and there was no communication on either side of that equation. And in the mid-90s, there was work done, a lot of research on what an entry-level job would be in industry that would result in a middle-class job. So getting a job in a large manufacturing outfit where you were in logistics and you work your way up to a manager of logistics, you could do that out of high school, but there was no discussion between, and it was fairly uniform what industry wanted in terms of skill sets. Nobody had talked to high school, so there was a real come to Jesus meeting. I shouldn't use that term in the church. Between the people. Are they realistic? Can you use them effectively in the classroom? We'll look at some of those issues later on. And one of the issues here goes back to that business leader's comment. Some schools had fractions in second grade, and some states had fractions in the third grade. And the military, of course, was moving all around. And so you had a very uncomfortable situation of students missing whole grades because the states were so out of alignment. So there's a whole set of things in here we can talk about, but those are some of the things that really jumped out at me. Apologize for the fuzziness here. I was doing cut and paste out of the standards documents online, but I want to get down and show you kindergarten, first, second grade standards in certain areas, and the structure is useful. So, and you can read these documents online. So, the first thing, standards define what students should understand and be able to do. That's all the Common Core state standards do. They define what they should know and be able to do at the end of the grade level. And it's not in any order. States can figure out the order. Standards are usually clustered because the teacher can read a set of standards around a given area. For example, here we have the domain of numbers and operations base 10, and this is a third grade standard. So here's a cluster of standards for the third grade teacher or the third grade curriculum coordinator to think about how the curriculum gets built. So whole numbers, fluency with adding and subtracting, operations, and then greater, less than, multiply, digits, and so on. Those are clusters, and we're going to look at that example in the next slide. Now, Common Core state standards, I didn't ask this question on my little true-false test, are only math and English language arts. The science is coming along. The people that wrote that are getting the science ready. Social studies has always been a big problem because that's where you get civics, you get history, and I tell you, there's not much commonality across the organization. So this is the easy side. So here we have the domains in the Common Core state standards, and if you look at each grade level, you'll see this one, this one, this one, and it changes to fractions in this grade, this one, and this one. Every grade level has all five of these. K is only the counting cardinality. So that's the structure, and we'll look down. We're going to look down inside this base 10 one in just a second. English language arts is an interesting area because there's really three academic areas there, and the standards break it out to 5. So the 3 are, and I don't think I had it in here, 3 are reading for literature, reading Edgar Allan Poe, reading for information, how to read the documentation for your computer, or how to read the tax instructions or whatever. Writing, totally separate activity, totally separate educational issue from reading. And speaking and listening, again, totally separate kinds of things. There's added There's two added categories, which we'll show in a minute, that get into where phonetics is, where you study the types of words like tense and person and that kind of thing. So there's some areas that are called studies. But ELA has always been that. There's a lot of stuff going on here. But in reading for literature, these four different domains.
Fred,
Any time for questions. Monty?
you mentioned speaking and listening. I'm interested, I don't know if you're going to, but what comprises those two areas? Like what gets taught?
I don't have any examples up here. It's not as rich, there's not as many things in there as there's about reading or writing, but there's a number of things in there that teach students how to give a book report, or teach students how to listen to a lecture and absorb information. And you can look up online, you can see the standards that are in there for the objectives. So,
one of the things would be like learning how to use an outline, using how to make an outline,
For speaking.
and for writing also.
So the thing which I wanted to set, this is the actual standard. This is the actual thing that the teacher or the curriculum coordinator or the state education department person is looking at to say, how do we get to this point in kindergarten? We've got two first graders here, our grandkids, and they're in this space right now. They're separating up tens and ones. They're doing stuff more advanced than I was doing in first grade in my one-room country schoolhouse with 9 grades and 1 teacher. This is a fairly interesting kind of math understanding, and then you get into the comparing tens, hundreds, and ones, and this kind of stuff. So these are the examples. The number here 4 indicates that this is the 4th. Remember, there's a collection within the domain. There's actually 4 in the 2nd grade level. This is the 4th one. I pulled that out because it's one we can all relate to. And then reading for literature. This I learned a lot on when I was both working when I got my degree and also later on. Kindergartners can retell stories with prompting. First graders retell stories but have an understanding of the central message or the core. And at 2nd grade, you're looking at other cultures and you're looking at what's the message, what's the lesson, what's the moral. And you're getting very specific here on reading for information, reading for literature, reading for what's going on, putting yourself in the place of the person that wrote it or the reader. And the thing that I learned, engineering, we didn't look at this too much, but these are developmental skills, which is the education code word. When I first heard that, I didn't know what that meant. But your cognitive processing develops at a certain rate, and this kind of summarizing and drawing together is not generally cognitively available to a kindergartner, and it becomes, at 8 years old or so, cognitively available to that grade level. Which of course opens up questions about what about kids that are slow in development and so on, and that's always an issue, but at least you're in the process. So this is a very rich set of stuff here. Yep, go ahead, Marty.
These PLDs and ages, how, I assume they are transmitted to teachers. Is that so? And how so?
So he's asking, how does the teacher get a hold of this stuff? And each state does it differently, because each state has the authority and responsibility to implement schools. And so the state governor and the state chief state school officer, the head of the education department, says we're going to sign on to the common core state standards. That flows into the education department, and whatever the state does for creating curricula, for selecting materials, for going for textbooks, for going for tests, the state often authorizes and funds the tests that get developed out of this, the high stakes tests. And then it flows down to the district, and the district then, each district does it differently, and there will be curriculum coordinators for science, for reading and writing in a district, and they will take that stuff and then process it and maybe buy textbooks in the district based on the recommendations or not from the state. And the teacher finally gets resulting. Am I describing this right, ma'am?
Yeah, you are. You're really, the curriculum directors that work for the different systems, if they're smart, they make sure that they get somebody from their system when they are actually writing the guidelines. In other words, in Newton where I was teaching, our math science curriculum director for the whole system, that was from K through high school,
10,000 students.
10,000 students. Maxine Rosenberg is her name. Smart woman. Made sure that she was on that committee when they set up those guidelines. She sat there and she made sure she worked all summer doing that. Because if you're really with it, then you can take that back to your system, your school system that you work in, and make sure that all your teachers get that information right away, and you've helped it be age appropriate and work for you. So the problem I see is that the systems that have the money to do that kind of work and send their people to that are the ones that come out on top. What about those systems that don't have enough money and can't send their curriculum directors to participate in that? They don't get that information till it's all done, and it puts that whole group of kids that work under those core systems at a disadvantage.
And the children fall through the cracks.
And some children fall through the cracks. Not your smarter kids. They usually will be able to make it anyway, but there are some kids that will fall through. So I really feel
So the
strongly about
implementation of these great ideas is important.
is very important, Monty, but I'm not saying that I disagree that you have standards, because I think because we have them now, it is raising that bottom line, that you're not teaching to the low end, maybe you are teaching to the average and the higher. And I think that's important if we want to raise our whole educational system for our brighter kids. But I feel, okay, I'll stop.
I can't interrupt too quickly because she's my caregiver and I don't get lunch.
Yeah. To go along with what Monty was asking, I think we have, in theory, to have a federal Common Core in education is great. But in practicality, a multitude of teachers were complaining that they were not trained. They don't understand what's going on. As you mentioned before, it's incomplete. We have in a couple of areas, but not the other areas. So now people are going to do 25% of Common Core. So that's confusing. But the teachers themselves were complaining that they were not properly trained. All of a sudden, they get material into the schools saying, you have to use this now, you have to fill out that form, you have to, and so on. Very, very confusing. So there's a tremendous communication gap here, and we're doing it in a very poor fashion. Better to have the entire thing completed and solid, and then have solid training throughout the country.
And what I want to do is deconflate the issue of these standards, which are thoughtfully done, and I can show you some of the thoughtfulness, with implementation, rollout. Is there too much testing? There's a whole set of questions you can ask in this. You're raising exactly the right point. Let's not shoot the standards because the implementation is bad.
I really support what Maria says. My objection to this is I don't see teacher input from the beginning, and I don't see teacher input as it's been developed, and it just seems to be another lay-on that teachers just have to deal with. the formulators of the Corps Corps were not teachers, they were commissioner of governors and school officers and so forth. Enough said. I am curious to know where the teacher input is in the formulation or the layout of this plan.
Let me give two examples of that. One is Massachusetts was very early on in this effort, and you can see the results. Massachusetts is always testing high. Massachusetts was able to treat itself as a separate country in the international math and science studies, and Massachusetts is coming up like second in the world. They funded this with big bucks in 1993. We have a history of having Republican governors and completely Democratic Congresses, so there was some kind of very, very active collusion. Dukakis had lost the '88 presidential thing, but he was still involved in a lot of the policy. So Massachusetts funded it and implemented it slowly and rolled it out in ways that I think you would think a lot more highly of. And the second point I would make, before we get back here, we want real life examples. I watched the math standards get developed as I was working. I'd either gotten a degree or I was getting a degree and working part-time, something I swore I'd never do again. And I watched the math standards get developed as part of the TIMS development. And you had two different types of people in that room, and it was like 25 people. There were mathematicians that understood math, and there were math teachers that understood teaching. And so you had this discussion going back and forth, and they didn't always agree, because what is in a mathematician's head about what you have to know is not necessarily how the developmental skills are in the students or in the classroom, or what's capable in the classroom. And that back and forth would be what I would call teacher input. At the end of the day, the standards that came out of that work, which got implemented across 49 states, weren't that much different from what was in place before standards. It just had been written down and codified. You wouldn't find it, as a teacher, you wouldn't find it a lot stranger. It wasn't strange, it was just codified and done in certain ways. So, teacher input is involved, but
It doesn't show. Let's put it that way. It's never in the media, you know? It's like it's not an issue.
who said Harvard guys know how to do public relations?
So I have two little kids. I have a kid in kindergarten right now, so this is all really interesting. But I chose to send my kid Montessori because of the different way they teach. And I mean, I like the idea of standards. I'm an engineer too, so I like the idea of standards. What Mike want to know is so you're saying that these standards are based off of developmental ability, cognitive ability?
Among other things, yeah.
Are we using just teacher input or actual research to say that this is it? Because I mean, I can, for example, like the bits about my kindergarten can count to 100. He can add and subtract. He's kindergarten. I mean, but they're teaching it in the Montessori with all these great tools. So when you're saying like some of these things are based off of cognitive, I kind of want to challenge that and say, well, is it because of the teaching or is it because of the actual ability? Because some of the ways we're teaching it isn't necessarily going to be, it's going to make, like if we're going to teach to this, that's not necessarily proving that this is the cognitive ability of the child.
What I'm taking from your question is, what are the different inputs that go into this? Is there research input? Is there teacher input? Is there experience input?
I mean, I think initially putting this down and saying, here's at least a set of standards, we're going to keep revisiting them. Is that also going to happen?
Absolutely. That's been happening since 1989. In 89, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics and the equivalent in science teachers came out with standards in science and math, and they were highly regarded. They were done by teachers, by teacher professional organizations, and they served as the model for a lot of the work that came behind it. The inputs to this stuff, and it's ongoing all the time, research is heavily input. A bunch of Harvard people make a lot of money doing research on what works and what doesn't. In Japan, a classroom teacher will spend underpaid time 5 or 6 weeks with a group of 2 or 3 other teachers saying, for this little learning objective, what are the different ways to teach this appropriately for different skill sets? The teachers, the classroom teachers actually go down and think about that. Not so common in the US. These are all benchmarked against international standards, which we know work better based on 10 years of testing. And there's organizations in this country, and some of them are fairly conservative organizations, this is not a bunch of liberals, benchmarking standards from France, or standards from Czech Republic, or standards from Japan against our standards, and looking to see where they've done different kinds of things. All that stuff is flowing into this, into the standards themselves. And we're talking about the metric system. We're not talking about the tests that get given. We're not talking about the teacher training. We'll get that in a second.
Well, I guess that's my question. So the standards are really just for outcomes or effects, not techniques for achieving those
Correct.
effects.
Correct. There's a rich set of stuff that has to happen. And if it doesn't happen well, and it doesn't roll out correctly, and training's not done, it's not going to work. Or it's going to be just one more and then we'll...
Just one real short thing. It just seems to me that the real underlying problem is class size. You know, Montessori
There's not
does
good
well,
data.
you know,
There's not good data.
LACS does well, they have very
There's not
small
good data.
classes, and none of that is reflected here.
If you go back and read the third International Math and Science Study, which was the big one with 40 countries,
You mean there's no research that smaller classes
let me
have better
say
results?
that in Japan, which is not as homogeneous as you would think, they were performing very high in math and science with class sizes of 40. But you had a teacher and 2 assistant teachers in the classroom, and you had a much different...
Well, that's the same
But what you
issue.
had, the neat thing about this research was, in 3 countries in that study, there was a lot of money spent on actually doing videos in the classroom in Japan and in Germany and the US. And you could see where the high-performing countries, how they did it differently in the classroom. There was research in each case about how much education teachers had, about how many after-school jobs students had in high school. There was a whole range of things that was looked at. And class size in that study was not so instrumental. It was the way that the classroom was run. In Japan, the textbooks are this thick, not this thick, math textbook. And you go into things in real depth. And the teachers are trying to do that. And you don't learn a little bit of everything. Mile wide and an inch deep was what the research showed the US was doing. And countries that do well, it's really deep and you get really good at some things and then you can go off. So there's a lot of research that's floating around in this space. Hope at the next slide. How many standards does a kindergarten teacher have to worry about? This is a rough count. I certainly threw on but this is pretty close. Kindergarten teacher has 10 in the reading for literature area, which I said is poems and so on. 10 in reading for content. Foundation is where you get your phonetics and word structure and how writing and reading is structured. Writing is obvious. Speaking and listening, we talked a little bit. Language is where you get tenses and person and a lot of that stuff. Kindergarten teacher had 44 English language arts standards. But the kindergarten teacher is teaching at least 4 subjects, so you can say they're close to 200 standards. Now our implementation in the 90s as a country, here's the true false. True or false? 2002-4, US have 25,000 active math standards in K-12. How many think that's true? Anybody false?
That's
Actually underestimating it.
Yeah.
It's an underestimate. Here's the numbers. I was running a database collecting all the standards across 4 subjects, and that database, I couldn't keep up. I couldn't get funded fast enough to keep up. So here's Massachusetts, K-12, set their standards up. They eventually went to standards at K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 high school. But the original setting was K2 had a set of standards, grades 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. And the average at each grade level was about 75. So Massachusetts had 300 standards per subject area in high school. When you multiply, I did the math easy here. Actually, Iowa didn't have standards for a long time, so it was 49 states. But if you multiply 50 times 300, you get 15,000 standards floating around. You're a textbook writer. You'd like to sell someplace besides just Massachusetts. How do you treat those 15,000 standards? The other problem that they found right away, as state departments of education did this, was you developed a set of standards, and 5 years later you knew a lot more than you did, and you wanted to upgrade them. Students that were halfway through one of these areas, you couldn't change the standards in the middle, so you had to keep the old standards for students that had started out in the old standards and the new standards for the incoming students in textbooks. So we rapidly got to over 30,000 per grade level. Per subject area. So I was dealing with 125,000 items in my database in national school. I was having to do students. So it's a very, the solution was an insidious one when people actually started implementing it. Everybody wanted states to be independent. That was the cost of independence. So now we get to the issue here. Here's the Common Core state standards. They were released in 2011, and states signed on by 2013. States are starting to peel back a little bit now. 46 or 47 signed on, it's now back to 44. Based on those individual statements, 44 in English language arts for kindergarten, probably 54 for first grade. Based on those, the State Department of Education and district staff then take those and say, what does our curriculum look like in the state and in the district? What units are we going to use, what lessons, what projects, what materials, what quizzes, what tests. Tests would be for the teacher now, to give quizzes, to give end of chapter tests. We're not talking about Big Mother. So all that has to get done by this set of people. Teacher training has to get done. How do you get the teachers up on this stuff? Because not only do you have to understand this, but you have to understand everything coming down the pipe. And then high stakes tests. Because we really are married to high stakes testing right now in this country. And by the way, high stakes testing was part of the original Ed reform plan in order to highlight inequities across school systems, racial and economic level. So high stakes testing was put in the mid-'80s so that we could see that schools in the poor parts of the city were not performing well because we had standardized tests across the state. This stuff costs money. Making these tests costs money. Every state had their own set of tests. You can imagine the cost when we had individual state standards.
Could you talk a little? My wife is she stays at home now, but she was a school teacher. She talked about the influence she felt Pearson, as a publishing company, had in this process. She felt like her hands were tied, that she had to use this curriculum by Pearson, and that they probably played a significant role in all this, and they're making out nicely.
Yeah, everybody points to the profit making. When I was involved, there were 3 big publishing houses, and Pearson was one, and then the one in Boston. McGraw-Hill, that was in Columbus. I used to have to go to Columbus. And the one in Boston with
State Farm.
that's one of their. There's a whole set of companies that do this. So your question is really Pearson or McGraw-Hill or whatever ties your hands, but that comes out of this environment here as what's chosen. And it comes out of the fact that when you're writing, and she's probably seeing textbooks from the older 49 states, she's seeing textbooks this big because Pearson has to write it if they want to sell it for every. Then you get into the Texas, California, Florida model, because Texas, California, and Florida, the State Department of Education would actually budget and fund textbook purchases. So if I'm a district superintendent in Texas and I buy what the Texas School Board says, the Texas School Board sends me the money for all those textbooks. Suddenly Pearson is really sensitive to Texas, California, the same in Florida. Suddenly those guys are really sensitive to those, and the textbooks tend to get driven by. So we had this insidious kind of thing, which grew out of, among other things, having 49 state standards and having that funding. So yeah, I was surprised when I started working in this space. I came out of the private sector. I worked for a company which was highly regarded. We had more women engineers than anybody else on the planet. We were always winning high awards. This was Digital Equipment Corporation. We were 130,000 people, second largest computer company. I was coming out of an environment where we were looked up to as good examples of responsible citizens. And I walk into this environment and I say, we really have to think about how textbook manufacturers, oh man, the gunfire would start. Anybody making a profit on education is suspicious. It's kind of an insidious problem. Make a comment here. The National Government Association has a department to do standards, and the Council of Chiefs of School Officers actually usually work for or are closely associated with governors. Depends on the state, whether they're elected or appointed or whatever. Basically, they work to write these Common Core state standards, and they used what I talked about a few minutes ago when I said you had the mathematician and you had the math teacher. You had the reading, you had the author, and you had the reading teacher. And in 2002, people started saying, what do colleges really want for incoming freshmen? Do our seniors have that? And in '95, I had a professor at Harvard that had done a lot of work in that space and found a real lack. The four things that industry wanted was 9th grade algebra, ability to work in teams, word processing, and writing a cogent 5-paragraph document. Those four things. You got those four things. So basically, we went from just this to those, and that's what got there. So the research continues, the input from other countries, the input from researchers. One of the things that's causing teachers to get excited is this area here. Of course. This is where the parents seem to get the most excited, and this is where the teachers, and this is the superintendents. So you can see the hot spots. And if the stuff comes out in 2011, and states in 2013 say, I'm on, let's go, and in 2014 stuff is starting to hit the classroom, you probably don't have a good rollout plan. You probably get those Fox News and New Yorker Magazine. Marty?
At some point before we leave, I'd be interested in hearing you identify what the problem is and then what needs to happen. If you want to consider it.
I think the questions here have kind of poked at the problem, and that is rollout process, rollout. I mean, you're talking about there's 50 million students in the K-12 system in this country and 5 million teachers. And some of those teachers are in places like Newton, which is tight with Harvard, and some of those places are in my hometown of Bangor, Michigan, 2,000 folks, 1,200 people in the system. And so having a national awareness that you've got to do this more appropriately is, now how do you fix that? I'm not so, that's a political issue, and it's one that will probably get fixed for us if we don't fix it.
So you're clear on what the problem is, but not necessarily on what needs to happen.
I think this is the right core. This is the metric system. This is what you want to have. It's not locked down. You want to keep developing it, but you want to keep doing this as well in a rational way. If I was General Motors, let's take a different example, since they just got a $35 million fine. If I was Toyota, and I was going to roll out a whole new robotic system for manufacturing cars, I wouldn't do it in 1 year. I would have a long-term plan, and that's what we can't see here in this country. Quick.
Another big complaint from teachers has been that the Common Core does not really, it's treated too much like a business, and it doesn't really look at the individual child. How do you see that? You know, such as Montessori, my grandson just finished there, and it's so much about what are your skills, we're going to develop those individual skills. This is very cut and dry and, you know, move everybody else along and that sort of thing.
I think an individual teacher would argue with the cut and dried model. And certainly, as I talked to Sharon about how do you do if you got 3 reading groups in the 2nd grade, how do you manage each group and so on. So I'd like to put that aside because that gets into how the teacher job is defined. It's a teacher job definition, which I think this country has a bad model for. In private industry, we ran a 5,000 person university in my computer company because we had to train, stuff was changing so fast. We really understood how to run a small university, and I think the teaching model, teacher job definition was a lot clearer there and would benefit from.
So again, the implementation we're not sure of. It's also, yeah.
I'd give you a pretty. I tell you what I think would fix the problem. That's another topic. Bob, let me jump to there's 3 slides that get into kind of the historical push, and I want to just hit on 2 or 3 things which are key. We'll do the test first. True or false? A standardized test can have different questions for different students. How many think that's true? How many think that's false? The teachers. Turns out it's true, because tests are often designed with a cache of questions that, and they're given online so that a student who's in a given area for a given learning objective can get different kinds of questions in that test and still be a legitimate standardized. Standardized test means everybody gets tested on the same thing. So there's some very kind of odd places where this is true. In general, standardized test means everybody takes the same test so you can score it evenly. But I wanted to highlight that. And you notice all my test questions have been true. I subscribe to the strategy that people taking tests learn a lot because you're really focused. And if you have pick the right one out of 4, and there's 3 wrong ones and 1 right one, you're learning 3 wrong things and 1 right thing. So I always say, pick the wrong one out of 4, and you're learning 3 right things and 1 wrong thing. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was a real sense that things weren't working. We had the old thing about, I like my lawyer, but all lawyers are dishonest. NAEP had started 10 years before, National Assessment of Education Progress. Congress prevented any state comparisons. Carter got the Department of Education in on a vote, on a slender vote, and his Secretary of Education, whom he wanted to fire badly, had a wall chart for 6 years doing state comparisons using the ACT and the SAT tests, and people were really pissed about that. You know, Mississippi was behind. Most of us are familiar with this, which that education Terrell Smith drove. And that was a thin book that had 500,000 copies went out. And the quote that people still remember is, if an unfriendly foreign power had put this education system in this country, we would have viewed it as an act of war. That was a strong feeling in that middle part of the late 70s and early 80s. Things were not working well. Remember Carter administration was really reviled and couldn't get the people out of Iran, the people held in prison. Reagan inherited Carter's, when we moved back to the United States, I was working in Europe for a corporation. Mortgages to buy a new house were 16.5% in 1982. Things were not in good shape. We were starting to realize that you could not have a middle-class job with a 7th grade education. I mean, I came out of Detroit, Sharon, Detroit. You could get a job and make a lot of money on the assembly line without much education. We already started to understand that problem. The thing which is interesting to me is the southern states were really behind, and you notice some of the names that you hear even now, were really behind getting state standards, national standards. And Reagan and Bush both wanted to not only keep the federal government out of education, but Reagan wanted to not even put it down to states because he was trying to shrink everything. So the National Government Association, who the guys were sitting there getting elected and saying, our education system ain't working, were the ones that were really pushing. So basically, the whole NGA thing started back then, and the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is each state's board of education, the head of the education of the state, really got in control. Setting national indicators of educational progress. 1988. This is the old, it's the red states now, this is the old Confederacy. We need to have national standards. This is a far cry from today, but I tell you, things were really in bad shape. Last slide. Basically, the NGA and the NEA pushed George H.W. Bush to have a summit. And you notice who the NGA chair was. And the summit, they went through quite a few iterations, and I can supply a bibliography. There's about a 20-page paper about the lead up of this summit and what was there. There's a couple more papers that are really good about what caused this, or what were the ways out of it. Basically, those were the four things. And this, getting agreement out of, there were probably 35 governors there. Getting agreement out of the White House and 35 governors is a big deal, because I was involved in the '99 summit. Picture of me shaking hands with Mr. Clinton, who was not head of the NGA at the time. And George H.W. said by 2002, I think it was, 2000, we're going to lead the world in math and science. So, and by the way, did I say they did not invite, oh yeah, they forgot to invite educators in Congress to this, which didn't win them any big marks either. At this point, IBM and Procter & Gamble and Boeing and a bunch of large corporations and the NGA got together and said, we said we'd do that. We really aren't making any progress. Achieve Inc., which was the company I got the job with, got formed, funded by foundations, $1 million a year, and go work this problem. And the guy that I took the class from on public policy got appointed the head of Achieve, so like I say, Harvard, $18,000 at the time, Harvard tuition. By '99, 47 states were committed. The TIMSS testing was showing where we were in real hard data on where we were problems. 2001, things were really starting to go, but of course we've done the model where every state has their own standards, which didn't work out as well as people thought. Is there one more slide? Here's Achieve drove this American Diploma Project, which has said, let's have college graduates, high school graduates, have the skills to do that. And then in 2008, they said, this thing ain't working. Let's go back and re-engineer it.
Where did the No Child Left Behind fall?
I always kind of ignore that. It's a big deal because there's a lot of funding tied to it. But, this whole effort is an attempt to leave no child behind, and that was, and George Bush, by the way, George W. Bush got a lot of credit for doing that. We're sort of like Nixon's trip to China. Nobody thought Nixon would ever go to China with those dreaded communists. Nobody thought George Bush would go against Reagan and his father and have something that would fund education nationwide. No Child Left Behind, there's a lot of funding, a lot of programs, a lot of stuff like that, but it all sits on top of, in my way of looking at it.
So, and then actually, funding is another question I had, was how is funding being restructured to get to
Well,
what
all
we're
the
needing?
states are going to be treated equally, so to speak. Southern states are not going to have the monies to buy books and everything else. Yeah, interesting. Political, right?
And then all these previous programs to get, I mean, are we going to go back and actually restructure everything so that way the money isn't sitting in, you know, No Child Left Behind and it's just all going towards the same thing? I mean, is that?
I'm not a good one to answer that because I haven't really tracked this stuff since I got out of the business. And I hooked Bob up in his business with a consultant that I use that really knows the answers to this kind of stuff. We could have her come for some time. A lot of that's getting looked at, and it's getting looked at in terms of how do we make this thing work better. So the kind of questions and concerns that are coming out here are not unknown, are known to everybody, and we'll see how we can do it. Jim?
Yeah, I came in late, so you may have answered this first question. One of the things that in pedagogy that seems always to be lacking, at least the results seem to not be there, is teaching critical thinking. Particularly in the sciences area, people are coming into sciences without critical thinking skills. The second thing is referencing some of this, what does industry need versus what does academia need, and so forth and so forth. Seems to me that academia, I mean not academia, but industry in general, has moved away from the journeyman concept of investing in their labor. They complain that they can't find people to fill the jobs that exist, but they don't invest in because they don't see that as part of the profit model.
Yeah, so you're raising 2 points. One is critical thinking skills, and are they on the standards, and the other is the industry model of who trains, who's responsible for the budget issues. The critical thinking skills are more embedded than they were. I didn't go back and look for those, but I invite you to go back and read particularly the emerging, this is the actual title of the document, Next Generation Science Standards, the budget with that, and math. I would love to have some critical thinking skills. Sorry?
And science, because that's where the critical thinking is heavy in the science.
Yeah.
You know, Fred, I think so long as our motives in this country in education are based on politics and based on what do we need to build up this country, we're doomed to failure. I think when we do get into critical thinking and what are your natural talents, let's develop those talents, let's be happy, and so on and so forth. I think we're in trouble. And this Common Core is getting more and more into, we're going to structure this so that you become that.
Yeah, I guess
let me not leave Jim's question in the duster, but I'll stay as long as you want, but I think I have to be in church to sign the book, I think. New member. The guy I worked for was he claimed one of the 3 or 4 people that sat in a Portuguese restaurant in East Cambridge in 1985 and laid out the structure for standards-based reform. When I talked to him 18 months ago, he said, we're starting to think in the area you're thinking about. What, in the high school model, what are countries doing around apprenticeships, around internships, around having a high school structure so that you're actually learning useful things in high school? And he had spent several months in Finland, because Finland leads in that. Germany and Austria always led in that, but it's a very harsh, you get tested at 12 years old, and Finland and some other countries are doing it in a much more, at 6th grade level, parents, there's enough counseling resources to sit down and say, what is your child really interested in? How could we look at that? How could we look at apprenticeships, internships, or training, or relationships with universities? So the advanced advanced spear point is out doing that, and I would say industry is interested in that. I would say that I was, when you see a legislator on TV, and behind them are these people trying to not laugh, their staff people are sitting behind them. I was one of those staff people in the Chief Board of Directors, which was 6 CEOs and 6 state governors. And I can tell you that the CEOs were the ones I mentioned: Kodak, Procter & Gamble, Boeing, Washington Mutual, which of course is not so held in such high esteem these days. But IBM was driving it, the university was driving it. Those people were thinking about the kinds of concerns you're expressing here. We don't want automatons, we don't want to train people that are cookie cutter. We want wholly educated people that can critically think and do math while they're there. And the governor's the same way. So John Engler from my home state of Michigan, one of the big drivers of education, Tommy Thompson, Wisconsin, big drivers of education in this place. They really had the model that I think we would all agree is the right one in mind. But they also had the model of you ought to be able to get out of high school and get a job. Or go to college. So,
I'm not convinced about how important myself. My experience with my girls is I homeschooled my girls most of their lives. My middle daughter, I was homeschooled until 9th grade, and she went to New York's charter school, which is a little different than regular school. She's at Harvard College now. She has a broken out. She's doing really great. I don't think she needed to have, Common Core. She obviously needs more than this. My oldest daughter, I homeschooled all the way through when she was 19. She started with TCP. This week, she got her second side of that. She was unschooled. I did not do school at home. Out of her interests. And was one-on-one. Most schools just do that. Right. I'm personally not convinced that
I would say you need to think about this.
But during, I'm about to turn 80. I went to New York City schools. I was poor, had no father, so what in the world would ever happen to me? My mother left the house at 7 a.m. every morning. A neighbor knocked on the door and said, walk to school. Yes, 54. There were 40 kids in all of my classes, and I hate to say it, but anyway, in the New York City system in the 40s and maybe into the 50s, they had 1A1, 1A2, 1A3. They segremented kids according to ability, so that the group you were in, the 40 kids, pretty much were doing approximately the same thing. But you know what? We 80-year-olds came out okay. Most of us went to city colleges, and anyway, it doesn't depend
Let me treat
only
that
on
first and then get this
one-on-one.
too. The folklore in education is that the New York City, all 5 borough school system was superior both before and after the Second World War because of the large number of highly educated Jews that had left Europe and could not get jobs anywhere else. And the teachers, I'm talking about the teachers, the teachers were people with degrees in math and science and so on and so on. So that's the folklore about the New York City school system and why people look back on it and say the results, the memories and the anecdotes and the data show that that was a high performance.
5 city colleges, and if you could get in, you had $5 a semester. I had 100 colleges.
I don't accept getting into Cornell as a proof of world-class, I'm talking of world-class performance. That's not, if you look at the data in countries we're going to be competing with, that's, getting in is not the world-class performance issue. There are kids coming from outside the country that are performing way above, and performing way above in the advanced degrees. So I'm saying the Common Core says stuff that kids have to know in order to do math in 9th grade. One of the things that Tim showed, because in 1996-97, American students at 4th grade level were above average. They weren't at the top, they were above average in math. And by 8th grade, they were way behind in math.
As compared to whom?
As compared to
Within
the
the state,
40
within the
countries,
country.
40 countries across the world taking the same
across the
standardized
world.
test. 40 countries.
Yeah.
And on close examination, because you start to say, well, this is interesting. Why are we behind in 8th grade? Because the school systems were reteaching K through 4 stuff in the 5th through 8th. There was no sense of pre-algebra, pre-calculus stuff. And so you didn't have challenging stuff. And that's where the Common Core is going to say, in order to be a mathematician or to have math skills, by the way, the guys that I was the project manager installing the elevator at Elliott Church in Newton, much like you guys did, an old building, putting an elevator in. The guys that were doing the installation had some phenomenal math skills, and they were not college graduates. They had gotten it either training after they got the job, or came out of a technical school or something like that. So I'm just saying that Common Core defines what you need to know in order to be competitive. And getting into Cornell or Harvard is good, but it's not proof that we're doing it.
Yeah, I think this.
I'll stay as long. We gotta leave at 10:30. Dave?
I mean, I've been trying to somehow frame it in my mind that this is a religious issue. But this is how is this issue related to us being in this space rather than in some other space, like literally space? That is, what are how do I relate this to my values, right? Because I think that's what we can talk about here that we probably wouldn't want to talk about, let's say at the town board meeting. If I came up at a town board meeting and said, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, that I believe that this is what education should do, I would be that's seemingly irrelevant in that context. But here it's obviously, it is relevant, and it's also relevant when I go to the town meeting because I'm bringing those values with me.
Sure.
So I guess that's as a preface to say that it seems to me that why do we value education? Why do we value universal education? What is the value? If it's a social value, then yeah, competitiveness is super important because the society its ability to produce wealth will allow us to do other things. So that's one value. Individual development is not the same. It's not the same value. My father would tell you absolutely not, that it's not about teaching kids school is not the place to be happy. School is the place where you gain competence in very particular things. So this question of school as what it should do as an institution socially, I think that's a bigger question. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that my dad, I know, had benefited greatly, not in New York City, but in Hudson, New York, from being told, do this, do this, do this, do this, don't tell me you're not going to do it. Now, I wasn't trained that way, I wouldn't want my kids to be trained that way, but that's a different value, that system had a value system. So what is our value system for education, and therefore what do we want schools to do within that larger value system?
That's another.
My position, my sense is that we want schools to do everything, and it's just not right. There's no way that any institution could do that. Could teach values, morals, social responsibility, and learn how to, do differential equations.
But that's why my kids are going Montessori though.
Yeah, and you get into
because of that.
the purpose of education.
Yes, but I don't think we've had, right now, this question that Jim, that it's driven by industry. So there's that, but I think that's a question we could grapple with here, or what are the values that we as an institution hold? I mean, granted, everyone has different ones, but I think that would be
a great
a thing here, right? Like, what is it that how can this issue get to our values as Unitarian Universalists? Because I don't even know what they are. I mean, I have 2 of the 7 principles that make sense, but after that, it's hard. So anyhow, sorry for the diatribe.
Next year's adult forum, shaping up before our very eyes.
I want to say last question, and then we'll say thanks to Fred.
Betty, last question.
I really believe in standards and evaluation. I want to say that since 1969, with the exception of the year that we were on sabbatic, I have been in the dear little Freeville School, elementary school, every morning, sometimes afternoon. And the many changes, of course, and the culture has changed and expectations. But by and large, the children's needs have not changed. And I used to be asked, and did, take individual children home with me for a part of a day. This is no longer permitted. But let me tell you one story. About 20, 25 years ago, Tyler and I went home through the schoolyard and the neighbors' yards in the snow to our house. We took off our boots, and I had the Tonka toys and things out taken from under the beds that I have kept from what the children had. He looked around with great satisfaction and said, "Am I going to live here now?" I turned away and cried, and he sat down and started to play. This is a boy of the many children we had who were moved overnight from one school to another. And I submit to you that the role of the public school, to which I'm passionately involved, must take many things into consideration. I don't put people down who can afford to work it out, to take children to Montessori and so forth. I wish that kind of enrichment were possible every place.
Thank you, Betty. And thank you, Fred.